Kia ora and welcome to the first Manaaki Whenua LINKOnline Webinar for 2024. We've got a fantastic program lined up for this year, and today's topic is a great starting point. Melissa Robson-Williams is a transdisciplinary researcher, and her work weaves social and biophysical research together to provide deeper insights and practical outcomes. She's leading a project to better understand the range of influences that might lead to land managers, including farmers, growers, and foresters, making more sustainable land management decisions. This work looks beyond the traditional consultants and advisors and bankers and peers to suggest a richer range of ways to reach farmers and support change. I'll be back at the end to help with your questions, so don't forget to put them in the chat box as soon as you can. But now over to you, Melissa.
Tēnā koutou. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
So, thank you so much for taking the time today to come and hear about Agents of Change, a research aim in the Moving the Middle MB funded program. So I have the pleasure of co-leading this research aim with Manaaki Cunningham from Ngāi Tahu and Ngāti Mutungaki Wharakoti, and we've got a great team who are listed here, coming from industry, council, research and practice. So what we'll be covering today is just a brief introduction to Moving the Middle and Agents of Change. Then I'll talk about the key messages from the research so far, and then spend the rest of the time unpacking each of these messages, and then rounding out with how you might be able to take on board some of these initial messages in your work. So Moving the Middle, it's the goal of the program is to give land managers more agency to take environmental action on the land. And the main feature of this program is that instead of directly targeting the farmer or the land manager, it recognizes that farming sits, or what happens on the land sits within a system, by which we mean a complex of interconnected network of factors, and that there are intervention points within that system that constrain or influence what happens on the land. So the focus of this program was to look at some of those intervention points in the system and try to free them up a little bit to allow more agency for the farmer or land manager to take action on the land, and collectively that's intended to move the middle. So the project initially identified 4 of these intervention points: policy interventions, investment practices, narratives, and our research aim, agents of change. So before I describe the Agents of Change program itself, I wanted to explain a little bit about where it came from. So about 7 years ago, I co-led a project called The Next Generation of Influences in Land and Water within the Our Land and Water National Science Challenge. We brought together about a dozen quite extraordinary individuals who are working in the land and water space. And one of the most striking things about this group is that more or less they were all trying to achieve the same thing, bringing about more sustainable land and water system, but they were going about it in radically different ways. So we had farmers and advisors who you might expect in the group, but we also had artists and activists and community mobilizers and Manaaki gardeners and folks who are passionate about food. And what I came away with thinking was that there are potentially so many other approaches, so many other agents beyond the traditional ones that we could employ for helping this shift towards more sustainable practices on the land. So when it came to designing this project about Agents of Change, and coincidentally, Manaaki, the co-lead, is one of those original next generation of influencers, we wanted to focus our attention on those non-traditional agents, the ones that have received not that much attention in the past. So like the rest of the Moving the Middle program, Agents of Change is trying to support this shift towards more sustainable practices on the land. And we're doing that by focusing on non-traditional agents of change. And our aim is to understand which of those agents are effective and make them more understandable, relatable, and supportable. So the key messages from the research so far. So we think that there is a greater diversity of agents of change than is currently being recognized or supported. We think that agents are intervening at multiple depths of leverage, which are concepts I'll come on to later, often without being intentional about it. We think there are multiple influence approaches that agents can use, and we think that agents of change work differently on whenua Māori. And we think that all of these things add up to more tools in the toolbox for supporting that change to more sustainable practices on the land. So under diversity of those agents. So at the start of the project, we did a range of literature reviews and interviews and came up with about 80 examples of types of human and non-human agents of change working in Aotearoa. This word cloud here is some of those, and some you'll recognize, what we'd call traditional agents like advisors, and some might look less familiar as agents of that shift towards more sustainable practices on the land, like art or the human-environment relationship or the environment itself. So this exercise was really useful to understand the diversity. But what it didn't tell us is which agents were currently being recognized as facilitating a shift to more sustainable land practices and which were being actively supported, and supported by which we mean kind of promoted or funded. So we've put a survey out to try and collect this data, and this survey is out at the moment. So given that there were 80 types, it wasn't reasonable to ask about every agent. So in the survey, we've grouped the agents and we're asking about which are recognized as agents of change and which are supported. So the current survey has gone out to a number of organizations who encourage more sustainable practices on the land, like councils, government, some industry and iwi organizations. And given that many of you are in such organizations and that we're really interested in understanding the full range of views within as well as across organizations, if you are interested in doing the survey, Tiffany's putting up a poll just now and we can send you a link straight after the webinar. So it's a 10-minute exercise and any help that you can give, we'd be really grateful. So I just mentioned that we grouped the agents in the survey, and the way that we've grouped agents we think is critically important for anyone working to try and achieve change in this area. So we've grouped according to this concept called leverage. So leverage is a concept in systems thinking, and people often talk about different levels in a system. And the notion of leverage is that intervening at this level gives you more power to make change in this system compared to, say, intervening at this level. So it's quite a mechanical metaphor. And people generally talk about these levels as shallow, medium, and deep. So I'm going to use this schematic of a catchment to illustrate some of the different agents who we discovered in the original literature review and interviews, and talk about the depth of leverage that they work at. So at the shallowest level, we describe agents as tweaking the system. So they're making changes, but the fundamental goals and the structure of the system remain. So the examples of intervention points here, like technology, research, regulations that agents might work on, they might speed something up or slow something down, but the fundamental behavior of the system, the broader system, remains the same. So a shift to a more efficient irrigation technology might make some savings, but the farm's still irrigated, land uses, products, customers, the system stays the same. So working at this level, a human agent might be thinking, the system and the norms are okay. We just need to tweak what we're currently doing to achieve our goals, and we'll get there through innovations to current practice. And you can see from these examples that the interventions at the shallower levels, they're quite obvious and quite direct. Moving down to a moderate leverage are agents who we would describe as trying to change the rules of the system and as a result, the system structure. They might do this through creating new ways of doing things, new information flows, new networks or new relationships. And you can see from the intervention points here, they're quite different in nature from the shallower ones. For example, a mechanism to amplify the voice of future generations in current decision making. If we adopted a device like this, it would mean we'd have to operate in quite different ways. Think how different planning would be if plans were over 500 years, the different information that we would need, the different perspectives that we'd have to consider, and the different priorities that might emerge. So working at this level, an agent might be thinking, the current norms are not okay. We need to do something different in order to meet our goals. We need to change what we do and how we do it. And then finally, moving down a level again to a deep leverage. And so this is where agents, we would describe agents as trying to change the goals of the system. And you can see these intervention points are more values-based, often trying to change the mindsets or the mental models and ways of seeing the world that have created the system in the first place. Working at this level, a human agent might be thinking, the current system doesn't serve. We need to think differently in order to meet our goals. We need to transform the why as well as the what and the how. And these intervention points, as well as being more values-based and more relational, they're also less obvious and often less direct. So it's not necessarily clear how worldviews or the human environment relationships affect sustainable practices on the land. But here's the interesting thing about leverage, is that intervening at the shallow leverage level is often financially expensive and from a systems perspective, not very powerful. Intervening at a deeper level tends to be less financially expensive and from a systems perspective, much more powerful. So you might be asking, why don't all agencies only work with deep leverage? The thing is, to work at these levels requires significant expenditure, not of financial, but of political and social capital to change assumptions and to change mindsets. So if you don't have that capital or you're not prepared to spend it, then it's really hard to work at these deeper leverage levels. And let's not forget, these values and mindsets and worldviews are not only hard to make explicit, they're hard to change. So in this research, we've chosen a series of case studies across the leverage levels, and we'll spend the next couple of years researching these. So here's a list of the case studies that we've chosen. We go from information and knowledge brokers, like advisors involved in technology transfer at the top, down to human environment relationships and reconnection of Māori with land at the bottom. So the grayed out ones here, there's already a lot of data on them in the literature, so we're not going to do any primary data collection. And all of the others, we're in the middle of the primary data collection or we're just about to start. And what we're looking at within each of these case studies is a range of agents, who and what they are, how they work, are they effective for influencing practices on the land, what are the things that help or hinder them, and how can they be made more visible, relatable, and supportable. So those are the agents that we're looking at and the depth of leverage that they're operating. As we're focusing our case studies on the moderate or deeper leverage levels, in other words, the less obvious and less direct, we really need to understand how what an agent is doing ultimately affects what's happening on the land. And this is a bit of the puzzle that will be critical for understanding which agents are effective. So to help us with this, we're using another systems tool, something called causal diagrams. So they do, as their title suggests, help us think about relationships between factors, but also importantly, how those relationships change over time. So causal diagrams, even simple ones, can look a little bit overwhelming at first, but they are incredibly useful in synthesizing or bringing together factors. So this is a causal diagram that we did a while ago, and at the heart of it is environmental health. And you can think of that like a bathtub. So the fuller the bathtub, the greater the level of environmental health. And the only way to change the level in the bathtub is by turning on or off the tap, or changing the size of the drain. So practices on the land can make the environmental health go up or down. You can do positive regenerative things that open the tap, or you can say make the drain smaller by doing less impactful practices. So we're trying to understand how agents go about their work in influencing what happens on the land. So I'm going to draw out 2 loops from this diagram, just so you can see how the tool operates, but also how we're going to use it. So we'll start here. So the difference between the actual state of the environment and what the public wants determines the power of this loop. So if there's a big difference, then there's more drive for low impact policies and regulations. The more of these policies and regulations, the more investment in efficiency type technologies. As the pool of knowledge on efficient practices grows, efficiency gains grow, although there is obviously a limit to how far efficiency can go. But this flows through to production, and as there are more of these efficient practices are put in place, there's a reduction in the environmental impact of each of these practices. So note that this doesn't increase the level of environmental health, it just slows the degradation. So this is the loop that we'll all be quite familiar with, and there are lots of agents who are already working in this loop, like policymakers, researchers, and advisors. The second loop starts in the same place, from the expectations of New Zealand public for reduced environmental impact, and how this influences education and in what we're calling in general mindset change activities. So the bigger the gap between the state of the environment and the expectations, the more it will feature in education and the more mindset change activities there'll be. So this can lead to the same production loop as we just saw, but it can also lead somewhere else. It can lead to a change in certain dimensions of the mindset of a land manager, for example. So maybe a change in how interested they are in maximizing production, or how they view their relationship with the environment, or how far into the future they're thinking. So from here, they might become less interested in maximizing production and more interested in maximizing other values, and start to focus on regenerative type of activities or systems, which in turn can start opening the tap a bit and putting more environmental health into the bathtub. So the idea is to use this method in each of the case studies to really nut out how all of the agents we're working with might have an impact from what they're doing through to the land. So before we finish, we wanted to highlight one last thing, and this is the different framings of the project between conventionally farmed land and Whenua Māori. So we acknowledge that these are 2 archetypes and there's lots in between, but it was a really useful exercise for us to understand why agents of change are different on these different archetypes. So starting on the left-hand side, land that's managed as property with generally a profit motive, largely externalizing social and environmental costs as the market often does, has led to environmental challenges. And this type of land use is represented by the circle here in the bowl on the left. So to shift away from this, there's a need to move uphill to new ways of doing things, to new ways of thinking about land use. So the work of an agent in this situation is about creating the momentum to move in this direction. For example, creating the picture of a different future, and then devising ways of pulling or pushing up the hill. And the hill itself represents deeply rooted beliefs, current economic thinking, all which present a challenge to moving. And then there are also barriers on the hill, things like lending and expertise that would need to be overcome in order to reach this new sustainable equilibrium. However, the situation on Whenua Māori can be quite different. So historically, sustainable practices were disrupted, and in many ways, these disruptive systems are also challenging and not necessarily very sustainable, and are being driven by needing to survive or navigate a colonized society governed by rules that are a poor fit for normal practices on Whenua Māori. So in this case, the intrinsic momentum on Whenua Māori is back towards sustainability, but you have systemic societal barriers shown here by the vertical lines that put hurdles in the way of a move in that direction. So the difference in the direction of the intrinsic momentum and the difference in the nature and the number of barriers for these two situations has implications for what the role of agents might be. Work on Whenua Māori is more characterized by undoing of things, removing barriers, reconnecting, decolonizing, all Res and Ds. Whereas in the conventionally farmed land scenario, the new normal needs to be formed out of a move out of a stable, for now, but unsustainable state. So this was really important and insightful for the project, and more generally, I think it really helped unpack the differences between these archetypes and why they might be, but most importantly, the differences that means for agents of change. So to circle back to those initial key messages and what they might mean for you in your work. So we think that there's a greater diversity of agents than is currently being recognized or supported. So in your work, you might consider who or what you normally support, and whether there are other types of agents who might be trying to do the same thing, and whether you can support them as well. We think that agents are intervening at different depths of leverage, often without being intentional about it. So you might consider the depths of your interventions or the agents that you're supporting, whether your aspirations and your interventions are well aligned. Are you aiming for system change, but most of your interventions are at the shallower leverage point? These are really important things to consider. And we wanted to say that you have to think quite carefully about this one, or seek help, come and talk to us, as we often think we're intervening at a deeper leverage level than we are. So thirdly, there are multiple influence approaches that agents can use. So you might consider the multiple pathways of influence on the change that you're trying to bring about, and maybe not just look at the direct, obvious, or proximate approaches, but consider some of those less direct, less obvious approaches. And finally, we think that agents of change are different on Whenua Māori, and so you might make sure that you recognize those differences in your work. Thank you for your time, and happy to take any questions.
Right. Hey, thanks very much, Melissa. There's lots and lots of questions coming in, and I want to say, first of all, thank you to everyone that's also putting in suggestions as to communities and particular groups that we should make sure receive the survey. So if there's someone else that you've thought of, feel free to add them to the list for the survey as well. That's super helpful. Melissa, you finish up there with sort of some useful tips out of what we know already, which is great. We're always keen to make sure that research is used before it's finished. But what happens next? What is the timescale for this research, and how can people get to know about it and use it as we get further along?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Christine. So the research has got about three or so years to run. But what we're trying to do is to, as soon as we find things out, is to essentially get them out into the public domain as quickly as possible. So at the moment, we're writing up a synthesis of what we've just presented. And what's coming next is, as we get down into a bit more of the detail within the case study research, the case studies, to understand who those agents are, how effective they are, and how they impact on the land, we will be getting that information out to anybody that's interested. So in the next year or so, we should start to have some more information about those different case studies. Great. We're also, just as a thing, we're also doing an event probably down in Aotearoa around art and artists as agents of change, and so we're hoping to do a small exhibition to talk about the rest of the research, but also to present art and artists as agents who are trying to be agents of change, and do a little bit of data collection at the time.
Fantastic. So there's probably a bunch of ways that you can keep connected. I'm sure there'll be further link webinars as well. And there'll be a link to the Moving the Middle webpage, which doesn't have a lot on it yet, but is the place to go for some of this research to land in over time. We have got zillions of questions. We're not going to get through them all, but here's one that I think is really pertinent. Does deeper intervention infer wider than a single property? Getting out towards catchment thinking and single property, wider community.
Absolutely. So it's not the only shallow and deeper is not specifically spatial, but one of the ideas of leverage is that you're influencing more broadly, and you're influencing at a deeper leverage point, at a deeper sort of a more profound level. And so it could be on a single property, but the suggestion is that it will go broader than that.
Great. And this is kind of related. Do you think that actions at a shallow level can influence the deeper level? For instance, someone that starts planting natives and changing their farm practices sort of turns into a deeper engagement with the environment.
It's such a good question. So I would say, and we've seen examples of this, it's a great agent. Somebody starts to do a little bit of planting, and then they might hear a bellbird that they haven't heard since they were a kid. That bellbird, the natural environment, and that bellbird then starts to become an agent of more change. So it can facilitate a deeper, a more profound experience. So I would say that the things can move down, but the agent changes. So that, yeah.
And a slightly different sort of type of question, but where do private property rights feature in the system of thinking here?
They're a really big influence on the current system that we have. I mean, they are one of the reasons, one of the dimensions of the current system, and one of the reasons why that there is a hill on the conventionally farmed land. So it is. This is not about. We're not looking at private property rights in particular as an agent of change, but they're quite an important contextual feature.
Great, thank you. I've got one last question. It's quite a long one. I'm going to try and shrink it, so hope that works. How will you understand which of these organisations have a more effective impact?
So which agents have a more effective impact?
Agents.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So great question. So we are in the case studies, in the data collection that we're doing, we're looking not only at the agent, but who or what the agent is trying to influence. So we're trying to collect data from 2 points, so the target audience and the agent themselves. So that's how we're going to try and gather data on how effective those agents are and what they're effective in doing.
Great, thank you. Look, the questions are still rolling in. You've got about another minute to add any to the list there. And we will come back to everyone who has asked us a question, and we will also publish the questions on our website alongside the recording and the slides for this presentation, so that you can go back to them and share it with your colleagues and so on. So check the follow-up email for more details and the link to the survey and so on. Thank you to everyone who did the poll today, and apologies to those few people that still had a interruption on their screen while the poll was running and just afterwards. As I said, this is our first webinar for 2024, and we've got a fantastic program coming up. The next webinar is on the 15th of February. And we're going to portal you to a new land use portal full of great information and resources. So a different topic again, but I know it will be relevant to many of you who've joined us today. I'd like to say a big thank you to Melissa and to Tiffany for making all of this happen. Watch your inbox for details on the next one. Ka kite.